Hey everyone, Charlie here. We're running a quick survey. We want to better understand who our listeners are. Do me a huge favor and fill out that survey. It takes under a minute, and the link is in the show description. This helps us make better content for you. Thanks a ton for listening. Link in the show notes. You may have heard that Bitcoin is complete, but did you know that Bitcoin has tons of developers currently working on trying to improve it? I spoke to one of these developers, James O'Byrne, today. He takes us through the history and the how-tos of how Bitcoin development has looked. And then we get into some of the thornier, more challenging discussion topics, such as the latest Bitcoin soft fork. Surprise, Bitcoin developers are always arguing about something. We get into it on Bitcoin Season 2. Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. I've got James O'Byrne, a well-known voice in Bitcoin development. He is a self-described Bitcoin developer who has contributed to Bitcoin Core. James, welcome to Bitcoin Season 2.
Hey, Charlie. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I have an ambitious goal of trying to lure the audience into listening as long as possible, talking about Bitcoin development. And if you're a listener, you don't have much foundational knowledge, I'm going to invite James to try to give some context on what even Bitcoin development looks like. Because James and others recently put out a letter asking formally the leading Bitcoin client implementation to work on something, a change to Bitcoin. So we'll explain what that is. But James, give us some context. You've worked on a lot of Bitcoin stuff. What are some of the high points of your career in Bitcoin to date? Things you've worked on, things that you kind of point to and be like, oh yeah, that was me. What did I do?
Yeah, sure. So I've been following Bitcoin for a long time, and being enthusiastic about Bitcoin around 2015. I decided to try and get involved in a more formal way. So I started to take a look at the source code repository. And for anybody unfamiliar, the way that you participate firsthand in Bitcoin is you run some program that connects to the rest of the Bitcoin network, and allows you to do things like send around transactions or monitor activity on the blockchain. And so the best known program for doing that, and really in many ways the only serious program for doing that in a sort of commercial sense is Bitcoin Core. So around 2015, I wanted to get involved, and so I started to hang out on IRC, which is a very antiquated internet chat protocol that the core developers use to communicate, and I started trawling through the issue queues on GitHub, which is the website that the source code's hosted on, to try and figure out something useful to do. And at the time, interestingly, antivirus software on Windows was flagging bits of data in the Bitcoin blockchain as being viral signatures, and then deleting all the data associated with the program. And so my first job was figuring out how to deal with that. And that actually had the nice side benefit of encrypting what we call chain state. So that, if someone embeds something nasty in the blockchain and you get stopped at the border, the customs agents aren't going to beef with the contents of your hard drive because it's sort of encrypted. So that was, I got lucky and found something fairly useful to do right off the bat. So after that, I was dormant for a little while, but in 2018, I decided to go and work on Bitcoin full-time professionally. Because it was clear it was going to be, a significant, like it wasn't going anywhere. So I went to New York and wound up working at Shaincode Labs until 2020. And during that time, I did a few different things. A lot of things that I did revolved around trying to improve the performance of Bitcoin. So I worked on a project called Assume UTXO, and the idea there, we can go into details if you want, but to keep it short, to keep your readers or your listeners awake, basically it's a technique for drastically speeding up the initialization process for a Bitcoin node, so that you can start kind of participating in the network as soon as possible under a security model that basically resembles the existing security model. So that project completed. Let's see, maybe 2 years ago now. And in the interim there, because what happens in Bitcoin, if you're a Bitcoin developer and you're trying to participate in the core project, you wound up getting hung up on review. And so it's not uncommon for, you might have completed your code change, but you're waiting months, years in some cases for it to accumulate enough review and eventually get merged into the code. So in that meanwhile, I was working and still work with a certain Bitcoin company, and they do custody, and so I was kind of privy to their process in terms of trying to improve their custodial setup. And so I got interested in this idea of vaulting Bitcoin. And the basic premise with vaults is that instead of just working really, really hard to come up with this super secure static setup of keys that you've generated and that lock your Bitcoin, vaults give you this tool for what some people call reactive security, which is you do your best to set up an initial secure key setup, send your Bitcoins, and then if you detect some unauthorized unexpected activity, you have the opportunity to intervene, and sweep those coins to a pre-specified location before the thief walks away with them. So you at least have a shot at recovering your Bitcoin. So I became very interested in how to do this and the protocol changes that are necessary to do this, and that's how I kind of got interested in the soft fork conversation and what people refer to as the covenants conversation, which is really just shorthand for how do we make Bitcoin script more useful. So I started to work on that and developed a few proposals there, and now I think we're up to date.
We are. And it's funny because for the listener, they may hear this and they're like, what do you mean there's people who work on developing Bitcoin? Like, it is a common, shared myth that Bitcoin is pure and doesn't change. Now, a lot of the theme of the show is talking about these things and, getting perspectives and diving deep into proposed changes. But I want to invite the listener to roll back the clock and try to understand the evolution of how Bitcoin changes and Bitcoin development has occurred over the years. Because we're 16 and a half years now into Bitcoin. A lot of people have worked on it, come in, left, come back. Things have changed to Bitcoin, but that has looked very different year to year. And I think this could be an important context for what Bitcoin development currently looks like, which would lead us into, I think, towards the end of this conversation, the response to your letter. So, if you can, take this any way you want, but what has Bitcoin development looked like over the years? Like after Satoshi put out the code, people started running it. What happened? And then, what did it look like when you were regularly contributing? And then what does it look like now? So it's a big question, but I'll just let you kind of try to frame this as best you can for the listener.
Yeah, sure. So it's a challenging history to cover, and there are plenty of artifacts and summaries. If people are interested, I think Aaron Van Weerdum's done a really good job of summarizing this stuff. But in short, so Satoshi released the code, and I think following that, there were a few people, a few regular contributors who kind of started to work on Bitcoin. Greg Maxwell is a well-known one. Vladimir Vanderlaan, who later became a maintainer. I think he wrote the first graphical client for Bitcoin. So a few people started to show up, and notably, a guy named Gavin Andreessen became maintainer after Satoshi stepped away. Gavin merged, which was controversial at the time, the pay-to-script hash change. But anyway, that's getting into the weeds a little bit. So Gavin stepped away some years after that, and at that point, the quote-unquote maintainership of the project turned over to a group of people. So a group of people were given the ability to decide to merge changes into the source code repository. Now, there's a lot of subtlety here because that may sound like, this group of people can unilaterally change Bitcoin. That's not quite the case. They have a lot, and we can get into this later in detail. They have a lot of soft power, but they can't just kind of reach out and unilaterally change Bitcoin because obviously anybody running the software needs to elect explicitly to upgrade the software. So, I think they fashion themselves as kind of, janitors in the sense that they're really just, looking at the proposed changes to the project, kind of gauging the technical sentiment around whether those changes are ready to go, and then merging the changes into the document that is the source code. And so that's kind of been the structure of the project for, since, 2013, 14 or earlier. You have sort of the small council, usually 3 to 5 people, who are able to explicitly integrate changes into the code and do things like cut releases where they say, okay, version 21 of Bitcoin is available now. Here you can download the software to run it. I'd say there have been, though, qualitative changes in the technical leadership, and I'm not sure if you want to get into that right now.
We can get into it in more detail, but I want to help us understand that there's a code base that most people run that is maintained by people and they have soft power, but how's the kind of culture of those maintainers and the contributors? How's that evolved over the years? Because you can touch on this either briefly or at length. We had one of the biggest forks in Bitcoin during this period, and I believe that it set the stage and kind of changed a lot of the course of Bitcoin discussion going forwards. But how would you describe the culture, say, pre-block size war and the culture post-block size war?
When Bitcoin was younger, say anytime pre-2016, 2015, and even during those years, it was very blue sky in the sense that Bitcoin had a lot of options for how it could go forward technically, and there were, widely acknowledged large technical challenges to overcome. For example, scaling. In other words, how do we actually onboard millions of users, true users who are actually interacting with Bitcoin, holding Bitcoin, sending Bitcoin? How do we enable those people to do that in a usable, workable way? And so, in venues like bitcointalk.org, which is like an antiquated, PHP forum that people were hanging out on, there were all kinds of ideas flying around about, ways you could change the protocol, or, do you want to raise the block size, or, can you integrate zero knowledge proofs? So I think the design space was wide open and people were talking about all kinds of things. And then obviously one facet of the scaling debate came to a head during the block size wars. When developers like Gavin Andreessen, Mike Hearn, Jeff Garzik kind of started to feel very strongly that the way to scale Bitcoin was to at least bump the block size one way or another. Explicitly bump the block size rather than something like SegWit, which is very implicit. And so they diverged, did things like Bitcoin XT, and the whole SegWit 2x debacle unfolded, which was this sort of traumatic, domestic violence event, within the Bitcoin community. And I think, there's a ton of scar tissue from that whole event, especially having to do with kind of the relationship between businesses and Bitcoin itself. I think, there used to be kind of a tighter relationship between companies that were commercially using Bitcoin, just because the Bitcoin world was so small, and the development community. And I think SegWit introduced a little bit of friction, or like sort of SegWit, the SegWit battle. Maybe pushed this idea that companies shouldn't be as involved in the development of Bitcoin at a protocol level.
Hey, Will here with Blockspace Media. Did you know that we have individual feeds for all our shows? If you're watching the Mining Pod, Bitcoin Season 2, or the Court Show, be sure to check out the individual feeds. You can find them on your podcast player of choice, whether that be Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. Just type in Blockspace Media and you'll find all our shows pop up, or just type in the individual show name like the Mining Pod or Bitcoin Season 2. Be sure to hit that subscribe and give us a 5-star rating so we can continue to bring you the best content in Bitcoin.
The way changes happen to Bitcoin now is I feel the least clear it's ever been. It's also, by my evaluation, we seem to have it's the lowest likelihood that future changes may happen that we've ever had. And maybe we can talk about your feelings about that. But in the meantime, you and other people have been proactive, saying we would like changes to happen. We don't know how to go about this. We are frustrated by the process, but we believe these are broadly held enough views. So we're going to try to put together some kind of effort, statement, coalition. What's important is for the listener to understand that it's not clear how changes happen to Bitcoin, and so why would you even say write a letter or a formal request? So let's just get right to that.
Well, let me back up and so I realize now where you're kind of wanting to go, and I do think there's some important background to all this, which is that even post-SegWit, I think there was very strong technical leadership in Bitcoin Core as a project. There were genuinely progressive, definite ideas about how to proceed, how to scale the system. There was a willingness to kind of grapple with these hard problems of how do we change the rule set of Bitcoin consensus, in a backwards compatible way, of course. But how do we change those rules so that we have the ability to scale and make Bitcoin more useful? The minds that presided over SegWit and Taproot, namely guys like Peter Wohler, Greg Maxwell, Andrew Polstra, to some degree, they were really widely respected by almost everybody in the Bitcoin community. But after doing both SegWit and Taproot to a large extent, I think they hit a point where they basically said, hey, it's not healthy for us to be the only guys, really driving this, because this is a controversial statement on my part, but I really feel strongly that the way, say, something like Taproot rolled out was that Taproot was developed, by a fairly small set of people, and then essentially consent for it was manufactured, because very, very, very few people really had a holistic understanding of Taproot. Even me, somebody who's highly technical, I reviewed that proposal, and there were even elements of it that emerged years later that kind of surprised me in terms of the net effect. I mean, I think I think the ordinals phenomenon surprised a lot of people in terms of how it was enabled by both SegWit and Taproot. So in any case, like I think the way that those changes got made was like sort of a small group of people decided, hey, these would be good changes for Bitcoin. And then the big wheels of consent manufacturing spun up in terms of, the favorable sort of journalistic element. Blockstream put a lot of money behind writing blog posts. Obviously, they have a big presence on social media. Bitcoin Optech did workshops for Taproot. So these big wheels spun up. And despite the fact that, there are maybe 30 people on Earth who are capable really of evaluating Taproot, in its kind of fundamentals, the tail kind of wagged the dog, and everybody came along because it was like, oh, well, this is what these guys who we, rightfully trust to make good technical decisions came up with. And I think that's not a comfortable assertion for most people. I think most people like to think that, the technical development of Bitcoin is this like hyper meritocratic process where, like the best idea wins, and there's like a ton of scrutiny on the ideas at hand. And that's sort of true, but the reality is that there's such a small set of people on Earth who care and are able to evaluate these things that's just not the way that it goes down. Or has gone down in the past. And so now, as you mentioned in your question, these guys, have sort of abdicated that role of leading the protocol forward. And it's left us in this vacuum, this like wandering in the desert phase where we're not really sure who has enough credibility to there are lots of, there are a number of technically plausible proposals, but there isn't really that sort of halo effect behind any one proposer that's like, oh yeah, this is the guy or this is the group of people who are totally going to lead us to the promised land, and we wholeheartedly believe them. And there hasn't been a great mustering of that consent manufacturing process, or to put it maybe less cynically, that like marketing educating process. So we're in an undefined state.
Yeah. And so one theme I have on this podcast is that we talk about the various proposals, and there are people who have favored ones, but I think you and I both agree that there's many proposals which are good out there. And the real question is, how do any of these gain consensus to move forward and be led by the leading software implementation, Bitcoin Core? Because it's really difficult for, I think, you and I to see any of these really becoming a software without it happening through Bitcoin Core, at least for now. So there are formalized processes to submit proposals, but it's unclear how those proposals get added to Bitcoin Core. And there's an abundant reason, and I encourage everyone to look at the Taproot Wizards BIPland chart if you just want a fun, like, goofy little visualizer to explain how like weird and goofy and challenging it is. But we have been talking about one specific proposal, opctv, Opcheck Sacrum Stack, and opctv for like 5+ years. There was an effort a few years ago to see if it can gain consensus. It did not. If I can put words in your mouth, it's of the popular proposals, it's one of the most conservative ones, and it's been paired with another opcode called Opcheck Sacrum Stack. These two have been packaged as they seem to have kind of like the favorability of being like the thing that seems the easiest to get across the line. But how do we know that there is broad support across Bitcoin? And this is where your letter comes in. Why did you write the letter? And maybe give the listener some context on like who signed it, because I think that's also important.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I started to really look at some of these proposals to change Bitcoin at the consensus layer back starting, 21, 22. And I even developed one called OpVault on the basis of my experience looking at some, various custody systems. But one of the proposals that I'd been tracking for a while is one by Jeremy Rubin that you mentioned called Check Template Verify. And Jeremy, I think, formalized this in 2020 and had been, educating people, shopping it around. He'd written up all the technical documentation that has to accompany these kinds of proposals and done an abundance of demos and, really an overwhelming amount of work on it. And he was sort of brushed aside by a lot of the a lot of the active participants in the Bitcoin Core project, because again, I want to emphasize that a lot of the people in Bitcoin Core who had experience thinking about potential script upgrades were simply not interested in the conversation anymore for varying reasons. And so a lot of the remaining maintainers are on the younger side, are more kind of conventional software focused people. And I don't think a lot of them, by their own admission, have a ton of experience writing, looking at script. And so evaluating these kinds of changes, I don't think was in anyone's wheelhouse. And so, Jeremy did all this work and he put together what wound up being a good proposal. I built a demo that, uses his proposal to implement a very basic form of vaulting. So Jeremy, sort of took a run at it. Didn't have much success getting adoption. He notably kind of got, I think he basically said, okay, well, I've had enough of this process. I'm going to just put out a binary that, you can run if you want to signal your support for CTV. And that was construed by some as an attack and just totally uncouth, which to me is sort of silly. But he kind of proved that, okay, there's, the process for actually getting a proposal evaluated to change, to upgrade Bitcoin script functionality is not really known. It's certainly not spelled out anywhere. And this important prerequisite, which is getting an implementation in Bitcoin Core, is controlled by a small group of people, basically, and it's not easily overcome. So in my own experience, I saw that happen kind of in tandem with working on OpVault. Funny story, I actually tried to develop OpVault without CTV because of all the, maybe it's speaking to my own cowardice, but I tried to avoid any of the sort of brand damage with CTV. And wound up just poorly reinventing CTV, so eventually integrated it as a dependency. But in any case, so then I got enthusiastic about kind of picking up the torch and trying to help lead an upgrade, or at least coordinate an upgrade. Do whatever it took to kind of move the ball forward. And I encountered kind of a similar process where it's some combination of a lack of expertise in the Bitcoin Core project on scripting, lack of willingness. And meanwhile, I'm watching the clock kind of ticking and I'm saying, okay, well, the market cap of Bitcoin is going up. We're seeing adoption in places that I wouldn't have imagined, we'd see, for another decade, like the US government.
I'm drinking from a MicroStrategy solo cup. So that was kind of a thing that happened in 2020 that nobody saw.
Yeah, I think things ramped up a lot more quickly than anybody thought. Certainly than I would have thought. And, this is another controversial aspect of the conversation, but I think to me, it's pretty obvious that as this adoption picks up, as the market cap picks up, certainly if the U.S. government considers Bitcoin some kind of strategic asset, it's going to be much, much, much harder to roll out even innocuous, limited upgrades to Bitcoin's scripting. because, and again, if you put your adversarial hat on, I mean, the whole genesis of Bitcoin is sort of trying to take, money out of the hands of the government. But if you're in a position where the government, has a big seat at the table, they could conceivably come up with all kinds of reasons for shooting down fairly limited improvements that say, further the ability to, trade Bitcoin peer to peer or hold it outside of a regulated custodian. So I think there's a really good basis for at least saying, hey, it's likely that as adoption picks up, among governments, this thing's going to get harder to change. So we should actually focus on kind of using the time that we have, making hay while the sun's shining, and getting some of these proposals in there. So that was kind of my backdrop while I was kind of thinking about working on this stuff, and I was just having sort of the same experience that Jeremy was having, in the sense that I was producing artifacts, wrote up a very well articulated BIP with some good co-authors, and just didn't see anything going anywhere, despite the fact that there was a lot of support, sort of anecdotally in the community. And so, fast forward to the last year or so, I think as nothing has continued to happen, consternation in the community has picked up, and people have realized, hey, this isn't a healthy state for Bitcoin to be in. What's going to happen next? And so, having experienced a lot of that anecdotal support, in chats and in real life, and on Twitter, I sort of finally said, okay, we need a concrete way of channeling this support and demonstrating to the core project that there are a lot of credible people with serious technical chops who really want to see forward motion on these changes. And so, and you asked who's signed this letter, and everybody on that list was personally vetted by me as, being an active contributor to some kind of technical Bitcoin effort. And there are a broad range of functions on that list in terms of people who work on the protocol, like Andrew Polstra, Stephen Roos. You're going to say,
I mean, you have. I'm looking at the names, and this is from the names. There are 40 or some odd initially. Now there's
66, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. But you've had major pools. You've had Luxor, one of the prominent developers at Marathon. Again,
F2 pool.
Yeah. So you had the CEO of Luxor. You had one of the lead developers for Marathon. You had Chun Wang, founder of F2 Pool.
We sort of accidentally, this wasn't a goal at all, but we accidentally accumulated 19% of global hash rate on the letter. Yeah. Again, not a goal, but.
Yeah. And of course, you don't have, Jay Berg's signature, but he's the lead researcher for Foundry, and he's him personally explicitly supported, given support for CTV. So that's just on the hash rate, the pool side, and you have major developers, contributors to notable projects. Is a very, very broad cohort of people.
Yeah, and I think there are a ton of people who are sympathetic to CTV and CheckSig from Stack. I wanted to make sure that everybody on that list was totally unimpeachable in terms of, hey, this person publicly, demonstrably contributing to, a Bitcoin project in a highly technical manner. And I think, those 66 people are some of the, hardest core technologists involved.
So now, if the listener made it this far, I apologize. We're going to unshackle James, and you can now use some of the coded technical language and, talk about things without having to give context. What's the response been? We could talk about this forever, but it's been a little bit spicy and maybe frustrating, some of the response. Where would you say the response is initially was, and then how the conversations developed?
It's been an interesting dichotomy between the response from core contributors and non-core contributors. Anytime I approach a Bitcoin developer who isn't sort of a core regular, usually they're very enthusiastic, which with a few exceptions, or even those that aren't enthusiastic say support CTV, CSFS, but they didn't think the format of the letter was appropriate. And for my money, the letter was specifically phrased to be fairly benign and just say, hey, we've got this 6-month time frame we're looking at here. We'd really appreciate it if the core project would focus some review effort, do some activation planning, because we should really get going on this thing that has broad consensus. It's, a change has been picked over, for 5+ years, check from Stack 7+ years in elements, in a live production environment with real money. So the letter was phrased to be sort of benign, friendly, polite. And most people, really love that it exists solely as a concrete way for them to say, hey, I want to see this move forward. The response from the core community has been one of, I'd say, indignation. They really don't like the notion that they're being asked to focus on something. I think to steelman their position, they'd say, well, we're volunteers. How could you think it's appropriate to request how we allocate our time? We have all kinds of things to do. This is, oh, no more letter signing. This is like the days of SegWit 2x. So that's been kind of the soft, emotional response. In terms of the technical response, I think the main thing to highlight is that no one has any objection to this stuff technically whatsoever. There are nothing even resembling kind of a show-stopping bug. I think the closest thing to a technical gripe that people have had is, oh, we don't want to add this functionality to, legacy script environments because we're afraid that users will hurt themselves. It's not even really about, there's this negative externality where someone could conceivably, run a denial of service attack by using, this new functionality. It's like, none of that exists. And I mean, what's important to highlight and emphasize as background is that SegWit and Taproot were these massive engine lift style changes where we're just completely reimagining how script interpretation works in Bitcoin. What's on the table now is check template verify, check sig from stack. If those are like engine rebuild upgrades, this is like, relining your brakes or something. It's like, or adding an MP3 player to your dashboard. It's like, you're really just slotting in very narrow, well-defined opcode functionality. You're not changing the framework in any way. And so, the crux of the technical objections have been like, oh, well, we don't want to, upgrade legacy script environments because we're afraid users will somehow do something crazy to hurt themselves or, use this thing in an unexpected way, which, there's a precedent for that for almost everything in Bitcoin. You can, send coins to an address that, you don't have the private key for, all kinds of stuff. So really, the response has been good in the sense that, I think everybody agrees these are benign technically. There has been kind of a counter proposal. I don't know if you want to talk about that now.
Yeah, I'm down to talk about it, but maybe before that, like, why do you think there was indignation? I will say maybe I'm naive and like I read the letter and I was like, this is about as like kind of a casual request with what seems to me to be a fair, like, here's like a timeline just so we can kind of like set appropriate expectations. Timeline for 6 months. We request over the next 6 months. You focus on this. Why has there been a pushback? I invite you to be opinionated because this is not these types of discourse are they're not without contention. So I invite you to be opinionated and give your honest thoughts. Yeah.
It's a really good question, I think, and it's multifaceted. I have to be honest in saying that I think there is a little bit of a distaste towards me and maybe even Jeremy in the sense that over the last few years, I've been pretty openly critical of the core project, of its priorities, in basically saying, hey, you guys aren't focusing on the substantial stuff that's going to actually kind of deliver on Bitcoin's promises. You're doing all this kind of miscellany and janitorial work. So I don't know if that played into it. Otherwise, I don't really understand, the animosity and the anger towards what I thought was a fairly polite request. A lot of people almost everybody who works on core regularly is being paid pretty well to do it. In many cases by nonprofit organizations. It's an open source project. So I don't really understand the anger behind getting a letter that's like, hey, we'd really like for you to do this. We'd really like to see this in the project. So it's a little bit beyond me, but I don't know. Maybe it's worth asking, Antoine Poinceau or Matt Corallo.
I'll probably have one of them on this pod just because it's, I try to get important voices and checkpoints. But there was an interesting response, which I did not anticipate, which was Greg Sanders wrote kind of a proposal we might call CTV Lite, or it's a very similar looking proposal, which is a new PR, which does a lot of the same things with CTV, like part of this CTV plus check, sigma, stack proposal, with a bit more narrow constraints, I believe. What are your thoughts about that? Like, first of all, why do you think that happened now? And then what do you think about the actual proposal?
Yeah, so I think it happened because and you saw this at OpNext, right? You had sort of a front row seat. The idea that CTV and CSFS are useful together for Bitcoin is just totally non-controversial. It's obvious. You have almost everybody thinking about second layer stuff saying, these are tools we would love to have. And so there's a ton of momentum, enthusiasm for them. So I think now that the letter has come out, I think there is interest and motivation in core to sort of serving the origin of that enthusiasm. But maybe for varying reasons, they don't feel like they want to just do what everybody's asking for. They want to try and rephrase it. Again, to Steelman, I think what Sanders and Poinceau and Roos want here is they have taken one use case of CTV CSFS, which is Roos's work on ARC, which is a notable second layer or a proposed second layer. And they specifically want to craft an opcode that services that and Sanders's Lightning symmetry stuff. And so they've basically said, okay, like, what is the narrowest change that can hit those two use cases? Because those are the ones that we think of as meaningful. And as a result, they've come up with a proposal that's only in Taproot. And it makes some controversial choices, which I'll talk about in a second. But the first issue that I have with it is the Taproot only bit. And that's because if you run the numbers, over the last 3 months, something like 96% of value moved around on Bitcoin is non-taproot. For the most part, people are still using SegWit outputs. I know a lot of custodial operations that are using SegWit outputs don't have immediate plans to move to Taproot. And so one of my interests, my big long-run interest for CTV has been vaulting. CTV both gives you simple vaults, and it also serves as a good precursor for something like opvault, check, contract, verify. It's a necessary ingredient to vaults, however you do it. And so my issue with the TapScript only constraint on this counter proposal is that it ignores a whole lot of contexts where people, for varying reasons, can't use Taproot. For example, if you're running a big custody operation, usually a part of your key setup involves hardware security modules, or HSMs. Many hardware security modules don't have Schnorr signature capability. And so they can't really participate in Taproot unless, they have custom firmware modules. Many HSMs aren't even capable of that. So, really, I think it's not certain we're going to see mass upgrade to Taproot for reasons like that. And there's really no downside to having CTV outside of Taproot. So I think that's a big drawback of the proposal. I think the controversial choices they've made are that, like in Taproot, there's something called the annex, which, to get really technical, is a part of the witness that is actually covered by the signature. You don't have to understand, what that means. Well, all you have to understand is that their proposal decides to cover the annex, which is a little bit problematic from my perspective, because the annex is like an upgrade hook that we haven't even really decided how to use yet. And so if their template opcode is covering that, it's kind of constraining the way that the annex can actually be used with the template opcode before we figured out what the annex is really for. So, for example, one of the big potential uses of the annex is cross-input signature aggregation. And so if you create a situation where now there's like an implicit constraint on, like when you need to know about the annex, because in order to use this template stuff, you have to basically pre-compute what is going to go into this hash. Whereas normally with annex use, you can kind of decide on its content at spend time. So there's like a temporal mismatch there that's being created. And again, that's like subject for debate. But I think the point is that, like, BIP 119 CTV is totally sufficient as is. It's been around for 5 years. It's had a 5 Bitcoin bounty put on it. No one's come up with any problems. If Sanders et al. really want sort of a slightly different phrasing for it, Jeremy and I have talked about, we have total willingness to add a TapScript only opcode that kind of does what they need in a very similar way. But I really don't see a strong reason to kind of reimagine BIP 119, which has a ton of history, has had a ton of scrutiny on it, is still a very simple change. So yeah, that's my fairly opinionated take on it.
A couple more questions on this narrow topic, and then we'll wrap with some kind of broad reflections. One, I am kind of surprised to find, as I have dived more into Bitcoin development and the history of changes, that like each change, well, the past 2 changes really, we provided, as you say, upgrade hooks. And it's really very strange to me that, like, while discussing and implementing a soft fork like Taproot, we explicitly define multiple upgrade hooks, which are ways which make the next change to Bitcoin easier. Like, these are things that we put in, and this is actually this is kind of a way that Bitcoin development has happened for years, like thinking about how to lay up with this soft fork the next soft fork. And yet the process of even like talking about a soft fork is so tortured. Why haven't we used these upgrade hooks? Like, do we just soft fork these in and then the conversation immediately dies once you try to like say, okay, we've got this hook, let's do the next thing? Like, why are we not doing that? I think a lot of people forget, like, did not realize, myself included, we included all these like space for all these new opcodes in Taproot, which is why we're having conversations about opcodes. Like, why is this? Do we create all this opportunity? We kind of set the stage to do this. Why are we not doing this?
Yeah, so there are 2 things here. The first is that there is a mismatch in personnel between, the group of people who constructed that framework with those upgrade hooks and the people who are now in maintainership in core. So I think there's been a little bit of institutional, you could say knowledge loss, or you could say perspective difference. But I actually think the second point here is probably more relevant, which is, in my experience, it is the assumption of many core developers that we just have sort of an infinite time horizon to make these changes. And so I think from their perspective, Bitcoin is this super long run system, and we're going to have decades to come up with the right changes, and why rush anything? And I think that's a very appealing outlook. It's a very grand vision to say, oh, we have all this time to let things, unfurl very slowly and to pick the right thing. As I mentioned earlier, I have what I think of as more realpolitik view on the subject, which is that we actually don't have a lot of time. Like the ossification process, is kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill, and we're like, some significant portion of the way down the hill. So I think for them, there isn't a ton of urgency in using these very carefully thought out upgrade hooks.
So let's now reflect. Calling back to OpNext, Alex Berg of Arc Labs had a good line, which I think provides finishing perspective. I want to get your take on it. And he said something to the effect of, well, if we don't do anything, Bitcoin will really suck, but it'll be fine. How much do you agree with that?
Obviously, projecting out into something as complicated as Bitcoin's future is very, very, very difficult. And so I am a security engineer by trade. And so I tend to think pessimistically about this stuff. Because if I'm not thinking pessimistically about it, then like who is? And you sort of hope for the best, prepare for the worst. In my estimation, if Bitcoin doesn't change, then essentially ownership remains or becomes even more concentrated. If we don't introduce like highly usable tools to let people take possession of their Bitcoin, you're going to have highly concentrated pools of Bitcoin ownership. And what I think is going to happen over time, not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, but over the next few decades, is governments really don't like being beholden to a hard asset backed money. And so what I could see happening, and they also probably don't like competing with a hard asset backed money, as we saw with Executive Order 6102 back in the day. So what I really worry about happening is if you have these concentrated pools of Bitcoin that are, regulated, if, in the case of, say, IBIT, in their regulatory filings, they say they get to pick, if there's a fork, they get to pick the side of the fork. And
they say that.
Yeah, they say that directly. So you could foresee a situation where there's some kind of sort of mandated rule change. And because you have this concentrated, pool of ownership, that dumps the sort of non-government favored side of the fork, tanks the price, miners have to follow, and so like that's obviously bad. We get to that point, and then it's like, okay, well, what did we really go on this grand adventure for? I guess you can say it enriched people with freedom aligned values, which is great. And I'm still all for that. So that's probably going to happen, which is great. That's not really what I got into this for. I got into this because Bitcoin is supposed to be a great, viable, non-state money that has a fixed supply and is censorship resistant. So like maybe all this would happen anyway if we didn't merge soft forks, because like people at the end of the day don't really seem to want to take possession and responsibility of their wealth, which is understandable. It's like highly technical, scary, prone to error. One of the reasons that I really, really, really wanted vaults is I thought that we could create something abstract that normal people could use, but is very safe, requires minimal hardware. I still think that's possible, but I'm not sure if we'll get there given the pace of protocol development. So I don't agree with Alex. I think, everything's going to be fine in the sense that like we're all going to be fine if we get right with God. But in a secular earthly sense, Bitcoin is not going to be fine, I don't think, if it doesn't change in the long term.
Spicy take. What do you think of this idea, which I've been like floating in my head as kind of an alternative, which is like, okay, well, we could probably psyop BlackRock into thinking that the changes which are aligned with us may also be aligned with them. There is, I believe, a pretty compelling angle that BlackRock may be able to open, BlackRock being a monolith and an example for that type of entity, may be open to like, oh, these are upgrades to Bitcoin. This makes our asset more valuable. Oh, we want more robust transaction fee activity, which is usually indicative of an increase in user agency. Like I like this idea. It's not what I imagined trying to pitch or the angle I would take, but I don't know. A lot of what I think I try to do, James, is try to search for that white pill to like keep me going longer. Where are you like? What do you think about that? And maybe what are the non-nihilistic white pill takes that you could leave us with as we wrap up this conversation?
You know, what you said is true. It's just true that it's in everybody's interest to have Bitcoin be a more useful system, even if you're BlackRock. Especially if you're BlackRock, like you want vaults if you're BlackRock or Coinbase. You don't want, you want to reduce risk. You want to increase operational efficiency. And so you're absolutely right to have that white pill that, maybe in the course of trying to make Bitcoin more useful for everyone, these companies kind of come along and say, oh yeah, of course, that sounds great. And then we get the tools that we need to, continue Bitcoin along its sort of freedom-oriented trajectory, which again is in everybody's best interest. That's what we're all here for. Is like, I think we all think that Bitcoin serves everyone's best interest fundamentally, if it's kind of allowed to realize its potential. So I think that's a great white pill. Personally, I need to work on my disposition probably. So that's nice to hear. I think otherwise, personally for me, and this seems to have a way of happening with Bitcoin developers, is that they get a little bit, it's like, I've seen too much, man. You get that 1,000-yard stare. So for me personally, I started a family over the last few years. From a technical standpoint, I'm fairly zen about what happens. I obviously I would love the best thing, for Bitcoin to happen. But in terms of like pure technical stuff about Bitcoin, I don't really have any white pills to vend. I'm much more focused on, family and trying to, explore Christianity more and things like that. So,
yeah. As a good friend of mine says, Bitcoin is only as decentralized as the people using it. In a way, the best thing you can do is work on the human problem, which is something we'll be doing for time immemorial. James, thank you so much for coming on Bitcoin Season 2. I really appreciate this. I assume people follow you on Twitter, but anywhere else you recommend people look at your work?
Twitter's good. Yeah, I'm at James OB, so feel free to look me up and say hi.
Hey everyone, Charlie here. We're running a quick survey. We want to better understand who our listeners are. Do me a huge favor and fill out that survey. It takes under a minute, and the link is in the show description. This helps us make better content for you. Thanks a ton for listening. Link in the show notes.